Hey everyone, Andrew here. One of my favorite features of the Laravel framework is the simple elegance of collections. These are essentially powered-up arrays that give you the ability to run and chain a wide variety of methods onto them in order to sort, organize, and filter given data. In this video, I'll be showing you a select set of these methods and provide some insight on how and why you would use them with a real-world large data set. First things first, we have a blank Laravel app fresh out of the box set up on a local development environment. Let's open up the code and head over to our routes web file. For this video, I'm going to demonstrate each method as a different route, but they'll all be wrapped up in one controller. I'm going to go ahead and use Artisan to create that controller now, and we'll just call it Collection Controller. Alright, now that that's all set, we can modify the landing route to use our new controller. Because this is Laravel 8, I'm using the new route notation of calling an array as the second argument to route get, and passing in our controller class, then the method name index. Let's open up the collection controller and create that index method. For now, I'm just going to return a simple string to test out what we did. Hello collections. Heading to our browser, it looks like our index route is working. So what data are we going to use for our collections and various methods? There's quite a few free APIs out there, but I wanted to use something that would contain a good amount of variety and some excessive data to show just how powerful that collections are at getting through all of that. If we head over to one of my favorite subreddits, I'm going to show you something that you might not know. You can append .json to any URL on Reddit and get a raw JSON feed of the data returned. There's no need for an API key or any kind of authentication, so this is perfect for our example app. There's a ton of data here, and a somewhat complicated and complex structure, perfect for filtering and sorting through. If we take a look at the collection documentation on Laravel's website, you can see that our description from earlier holds up. Collections are a fluent, convenient wrapper for working with arrays of data. You can also check out the dozens of methods that are available to use with them. And all that we need to do to create one is pass in an array to the global collect method available throughout the Laravel framework. Heading back to our collection controller, let's add in a private posts property. Then let's create a constructor that grabs the subreddit JSON that we saw earlier using Laravel's built-in HTTP library. Finally, we populate posts as a collection, consisting of the subreddit's individual posts found as the data children items in the JSON feed. Doing this in the constructor, we can initialize and access the post collection from any method that we decide to tack onto this controller. Let's make sure this works by replacing the hello collections return with the post property that we just initialized. Heading to our browser and refreshing, we are presented with our collection. Since we're returning the whole thing, Laravel is automatically dumping it out as JSON, so that's expected. Well, how about we do something to show off our data in a little bit more of a visual way? Let's create a view called Collections Index and pass in our post property. Now I'm just going to scaffold out a simple layout template for this view and any other ones that we decide to use, using the default view as a starting point. That looks good, so let's work on our actual collections index view. Extending the default layout, let's add in a title. We can then run a for each loop over the collection, treating it just like a regular array. And we'll output a link to each of the posts. Both the URL and the title are kept under the data index. Okay, let's see how this looks. Perfect. We have each of our posts from the subreddit JSON feed displayed out in this view. Clicking on one opens up the URL submitted for that post as well. And here's where collections can come in handy. This top item here isn't a link to an image, it's a link back to Reddit with a text post. What if we wanted to easily remove any non-image posts from this feed? Let's head back to our code, and we can get started with our first example, the filter method. In our routes web file, we're going to create a new route, filter, and connect it to a filter method on our collection controller. With an array in PHP, we might be tempted to do something like initialize an array of filtered posts, then run through a for each loop of the post and add in a post to that array if it passes a set of criteria. But with collections, we can chain on the filter method. This works a bit like the array filter method in vanilla PHP. The only argument is a closure function consisting of the current item in the collection and the key. Then, depending on the Boolean value of the return, that item is either kept or discarded. Looking back at our data source, there's a post_hint attribute under each post that can be used to determine if the post is an image. So we can return the result of a conditional checking that the post hint equals image. And then add the new filtered post to a collections filter view for display. You can also run multiple conditionals within the closure, breaking for a Boolean return to exit early. For instance, if a post hint doesn't equal an image, we want to immediately discard that post. Continuing if it does, we want to only keep those posts whose URL contains the i.read.it domain. And we run that comparison with Laravel's strcontains helper. In order to display these filtered posts, let's copy our index blade template as filter blade. Update the title to reflect the contents, and add in the thumbnail from the post as well. Since each post has an image, we know the thumbnail will always be present. Alright, let's see what that looks like. Perfect! Our filtered posts just containing images from Reddit's image host are displayed just as expected. Let's move on to our next example, Pluck. Just like with the filter demo, we'll create a new route and collections controller method just for this. Pluck is an insanely useful method, and what it does is it allows us to pull out values nested in large data sets and create flattened arrays with just those values. For example, let's take the filtered image post that we just created. Then, let's tack on the Pluck method, passing in data.url. After that, the all method will retrieve all of those values found as an array. The dot notation used here signifies a nested attribute. Data corresponds to the data key of each post element, and then the URL key under that array. It traverses each post, taking the URL out of each of them, and puts them into our post variable as a single, flattened array of URLs. Just like we did previously, let's create a new corresponding view from our filter blade template. Since this is a flattened array, each image represents a string consisting of the URL. So we're just going to display these images outright by echoing that value in the source attribute. Loading up our Pluck route, and everything is displaying correctly. Each image from our filtered post is being shown, and our large data set that we were traversing earlier has been reduced to a small array of URLs. Next on the list is contains. Adding a new route and method to our controller, let's start out by pulling in our code from the Pluck example. And make a quick modification to the copied blade template. Now, let's say that you wanted to do something like show a different view if no posts were found from our filter method. You might add a conditional to check if the post array is empty, and then perform your action based on that value. However, there's a caveat. You're wasting processing power and memory by running the filter first, and depending on the amount of data and complexity of your collection, that could eat up valuable resources. Instead, that's where contains comes in. We can call this post contains and pass in the key, or nested key with dot notation, as well as the value that we're looking for. What this does is returns a simple boolean true or false, depending on if the value in the second argument is found in any of the elements under the key provided throughout the whole collection. That way, we save time and resources determining if we even need to run the filter in the first place. Let's create this blade template for an empty collection and see how this works. Navigating to contains, we see that we're pulling in post images as expected. Now let's change the data source to a subreddit that doesn't use images, like Ask Reddit. Navigating back, we see that we're displaying the blade template for an empty collection, showing that contains has returned false. Next on the list, GroupBy. I'll just create our route and controller method for it. And let's do something a little different with this one. We're going to use the filter method and only pull in posts that have a post hint of self or image using the return value of inArray. Chaining onto that, we're going to call GroupBy and pass in the nested data post hint key with dot notation. Finishing it up, toArray, which will, as you might expect, return the collection as an array. What GroupBy is going to do is return back our collection broken up into separate child arrays based on the post hint value for each element. Those arrays will be keyed by the unique values of the post hint attribute, in this case, either self or image. To see why this is helpful, I've created a new blade template. looping over each post as a type associated with children, we can just include a separate blade file determined by the value of that type variable. We know that we have two possibilities, self and image. For self, let's go through each of the children posts and echo out the value of the self_text_HTML attribute. For images, we'll just show the image contained in the URL. Now, if we visit the GroupBy route, we can see our data has been broken down into two groups. The self post first, listing out any that might be here, and then the image posts following. Let's return the raw posts, and I'll show you what the array actually looks like. See, we have our two group arrays keyed as self or images, and then under them, the items whose data posts and attributes contain those respective values. Okay, following this, we have SortBy. New route and new controller method. And we'll start by pulling in the GroupBy code from earlier. Let's remove the GroupBy call and replace it with SortBy, passing through the data title nested attribute using dot notation. After that, a call to values resets any keys of the original array, and finally all, to ensure that the entire collection comes through. I'm also going to update the filter here to show us only image post hints. Let's create a new blade template to see if this changes our data display. Loading up the SortBy route, this method is pretty self-explanatory. It sorts the data by the attribute that you pass in. In our case, it's currently sorting by the title, alphabetically. By default, this works in the ascending order. If we wanted to swap that, we unfortunately can't pass in a second argument to just say descending, but we can update the method to call SortBy DESC instead, and that will reverse the order. Alright, next up we have one of the more interesting ones, partition. After creating our route and controller method, let's hop back over to the original data source from Reddit. You can see that nested in each post data object, there's an ups attribute. This is the amount of upvotes, as an integer, that the post has currently received. Now let's say that we wanted to split our posts into two separate collections based on that value. That's where the beauty of partition comes into play. If we create two variables using list, let's say popular posts and regular posts, we can use this post partition and pass in a closure function with a post object as the only argument. Then, those two collections are populated by the Boolean value returned in that closure. For instance, we're going to return true if the post's data ups attribute is greater than 1,000. This means that posts that have over 1,000 upvotes will go into the popular post collection, while the rest will go into the regular post collection. Let's create a blade template for these and see how we can display them. We'll pass in both collections. Update the title of the view, and run 2 for each loops, one for each collection, displaying the link and the thumbnail for each of them. Separated by popular posts and regular posts headings. Alright, let's navigate to the partition route and... Okay, maybe we shouldn't have the thumbnail since not all of these are images. Showing the actual upvote amounts might be a bit better. Okay, that's looking good. You can see they're separated by posts that have over 1,000 upvotes, and those that don't. Although, the order is a little messy. Luckily though, since partition returns collections, we can call SortBy on both of them directly. Let's sort them both by descending, and by the ups amount. Perfect. Keeping this going with a new route and collections controller method, our next example is reject. Pretty straightforward for how it sounds, this method works similar to filter, but purely removes elements based on the true and false return of the closure function. Using the idea of popular posts as an example, let's reject any post whose ups amount is less than 1,000. And return a view to display these. Because the post variable is a collection, like with partition, we can sort the results by the data ups amount. Just making some slight adjustments to our view. And let's see how this looks. Alright, we have our list of popular posts, ones that have over 1,000 upvotes, and they're sorted in descending order. Next up, WhereIn. Just creating a new route and controller method for it. And let's pre-populate this with the code from our GroupBy example earlier. This whole filter block right here, where we're using a closure to determine if the post hint value is one of an array of possibilities, can be reduced drastically using WhereIn. We just have to pass in the key as the first argument, and it can be nested using dot notation like our other examples. Then the array of possible values for that key as a second argument. This will return just those posts whose post hint value is either self or image. Let's create a new blade template for this method, just like we did with the GroupBy example. And navigating to the WhereIn route, we can see the results we're expecting. The same self and image post groups, just with a little bit more simplified syntax. Now let's take a look at chunk, after we create a route and controller method for it. This is a pretty straightforward and simple method, but can be very useful when it comes to front-end development. Using the chunk method, your collection is broken into smaller arrays. The amount of each is determined by the integer passed into the method's argument. We're using 2 here, and then adding them to a new blade template. In that template, instead of running a for each loop on the post to get an individual post, we're getting a chunk containing 2 posts each. In this loop, we can do layout and markup additions, like add in a bootstrap row. And then we can run a for each on the chunk to get the individual posts. And continue with our layout. Now if we navigate over to the chunk path, we see 2 posts each, separated by rows. In the source, this is verified with each chunk being represented by a bootstrap row, and each of those row elements containing 2 individual posts. Moving on, we have a super simple method called count. Let's create the route and collection controller method for that. And we'll pass in the code from the reject example earlier. In our layout for it, let's say that we wanted to display the amount of posts that were in our collection. We could call count directly on posts, but only if we use the toArray method first. Or we can just use the collection method count. And visiting the count route, we can see that there is 7 popular posts here, just as expected. Okay, I'll admit, that was incredibly simple. We're almost done here, but now let's take a look at first. Creating a route and controller method for it, what if we want to return a single post that meets a condition? Using this post first, it expects a closure function. Looping through the posts, as soon as the return of that function is true, the current post object will be returned and the loop stopped. Let's find the first post that has over 1,000 upvotes, and use a new blade template to display this. Alright, visiting the first route, and it looks like that's exactly what we're expecting. It has over 1,000 upvotes. However, there's another similar method that we can use to simplify this further. Because we're returning the result of a comparison in the closure, we can change first to first where. Then pass in the key whose value we're comparing. In this case, it's nested using dot notation. And after that, our comparison operator, greater than. Finally, the value that we're comparing, 1000. This single line accomplishes the same thing as our closure function did earlier, and we can prove that by heading back to our browser and refreshing. See? Exactly the same. Okay, on to our last example, tap. Let's create the final test route and controller method. And pre-populate this with the code from the SortBy example. Below the SortBy descending call, let's add in tap. Now, tap is an interesting method because it doesn't actually affect the collection in question at all. Tap allows you to accomplish something between collection methods, grabbing the whole collection in its current state without affecting the values that are being returned back. So for example, let's say that after sorting we want to log the IDs of the posts that are in the current collection. Tap takes a single argument, a closure function with the collection, and inside of that we can write to the log. We'll display some text, the number of items in the collection using the count method, and then the IDs by pulling them into a flattened one-dimensional array with Pluck. Finally, let's create our test blade template and see how this works. We'll have to load up the tap route, and while it doesn't look like anything has happened, let's check the log. There it is. We've logged that there are 24 posts, and the IDs from each of them have been dumped in here as well. Alright, well that about wraps it up for this video. You've learned about creating and working with Laravel Collections, including 12 different methods that you can use to sort and organize larger datasets. Huge thanks to my GitHub sponsors and everyone else who continues to support these videos. As always, if you have any questions about this or any other web development topics, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments or on my Twitter linked below. Thanks for watching.